Hello, everybody. It's Joe from MiddleGround Mic, and today we got an episode called A Sickening Synergy. This is a story of how the food we trust and the medicine we depend on quietly fused into a single profit machine that seems to grow stronger every time an American gets sick. It's the hidden loopholes inside of our economy, and once you see it, you just can't unsee it, whether it's intentional or not. Because it's become every aisle you walk through, every snack you buy, every medical bill you pay, all seems to feed to the same parts. The United States is the sickest, wealthy nation on earth. We spend more on healthcare than the next 10 countries combined. Yet we have the lowest life expectancy of any developed nation. Over 60% of Americans now live with at least one chronic disease. 40% have two or more. 90% of our staggering near $5 trillion healthcare bill goes to treating illnesses that in many cases begin with our food. Here's the kicker. Some of these things aren't random. They're just a result of our bad personal choices. They're predictable engineered outcomes of a food system inadvertently built not to nourish you, but to hook you. And a healthcare system built to cure you, not to cure you, but to manage you. And behind both systems, behind the cereal aisle, behind the pharmacy counter, sit the same financial giants, pulling the same threads. Tonight is part one of a two-part investigation. Tonight, we expose the architecture of the problem, the players, the chemicals, the ownership, the corruption. Part two is going to be, how do we fight it? So let's begin at ground zero of the American sickness crisis. You know, walk into any store, actually cut that part out. You know, and if you could go buymeacoffee.com/the MGM, you know, it would really help us, help support the show, and help push us forward. You can donate whatever you can. I would really, really appreciate it. The link will be in the description as well. All right, let's let's jump into it. Let's get into some of the stuff. You know, you walk into any grocery store and you look closely, like you really look at what fills the shelves. It's rows and rows of brightly colored boxes. Think of casinos, you know, and bags filled with ultra crazy processed engineered stuff, not for health, not even for necessarily taste, but for addiction. And we're going to talk more about that. You know, in this country, nearly 6% of everything we consume for calorie wise comes from ultra processed foods. Compare that with 14 to 20% in France, 10% in Japan. See the differences? Our healthcare mirrors it. You know, the obesity rate here is crazy. South Korea, it's only 5%. We're not slightly unhealthier. We're off the charts. And it's because Americans have become lazier, me included. It's because our food is fundamentally different. And a lot of things we do become sedative. That's something I'm trying to change myself. Working harder at it, Never give up. It's not easy for anybody. Let's keep going. You know, ultra processed foods, you know, they're chemically designed to manipulate the architecture of human biology. They target for the dopamines, you know, they override your safety signals, you know, they stimulate cravings, they create repetitive, compulsive eating patterns. Think of habits you've picked up in the past, smoking, etc. That mirror the behavior seen in addiction studies. You know, salt for stimulation, sugar for dopamine, you know, industrial fats for opioid activation. Why do you think a lot of us like fatty foods? Your body's designed to in these. It's no different. And this sounds sinister, right? I mean, principally it is. Ethically it is to a degree. But this is no different than when you're at your job and you're trying to sell something to someone, right? We shouldn't be doing these things. We shouldn't have to have this conversation, but this is how it's viewed. But this is what it is. We need to change it, but this is what it is. You know, we're going to combine all this, you know, the bliss point, right? Things have become a perfect storm. You know, the palatability that causes the brain to crave more even when the body's had more than enough. You know, this isn't just speculation. This is crazy food science. Billions of dollars of research keep going into creating the stuff that make your brain lit up like a Christmas tree. You know, snack companies openly admitted in trade journals, they call it high repeat consumption optimization. Translation, we want you hooked. And the results are becoming catastrophic. 42% of Americans are obese. The highest rate ever recorded we know of in world history. 11% have become diabetic, 30% more have become pre diabetic, and nearly 88% of adults are metabolically unhealthy, meaning their blood sugar, blood, their blood pressure, their cholesterol, their waist, circumference, elevated risk of chronic disease because of this. Let's compare. Japan, 4% obesity, Italy, 13, France, 17, United States, 42. We're not dealing with genetics here. That's part of it, but we're dealing with a food environment that has turned metabolic disease into a norm inadvertently. And nowhere is the impact clearer than in children. Children now in this country now have obesity rates higher than the adults in most other wealthy nations. They're developing type 2 diabetes, once known as adult onset, as young as 7. Fatty liver disease, I've been there. It's becoming common in teenagers. Why? Because our children are targeted more aggressively than any other segment. The average American child can see up to 4,000 to 6,000 food ads in a year. 98% are junk food, sugary cereals, pop, chips, cartoons, these mascots, these bright colors, these games, these prizes, psychological warfare aimed at lifelong eating patterns before the brain even fully develops. By age 3, most children can recognize food logos before they can spell their own name. By age 8, they can identify nearly 100 branded processed foods in 2 seconds or less. That's being sarcastic. But, ask them to identify vegetables. Some of them can, some can't. And the numbers fall off, right? This isn't cultural, it's conditioning. And when these foods enter the body, the damage begins fast. Think about carbs, or when you eat something that you shouldn't, right? You feel it. Your sugar spikes the insulin, right? Which blocks fat burning, drives fat storage. The sodium stiffens your arteries and elevates the risk of stroke. Industrial seed oils inflame your tissue. Chemicals, disrupt your hormones. The artificial dyes are linked to, some of it's linked to hyperactivity in children. Within a decade of eating the standard American diet, the human body begins failing at certain things. And when it fails, that's when the fat really starts setting in. And when the pancreas burns out, when the arteries harden, when the liver fills with the visceral fat, guess who steps in to profit next? Big pharma, big insurance, big hospitals. The food industry creates the customer for the medical industry. And the outcome behind both, same 4, 5, 6 owners, depending on the company. And that's where we're going to go next. It's wild. It's like a web. The same 3 financial firms own a big chunk of the food infrastructure. It's kind of crazy when you look at it. It's BlackRock, State Street. I know Buffett's companies in there too. To really kind of let's start from the beginning of that part, right? If you really want to understand why food makes us sick and medicine doesn't maybe get you as better as you think it should, and a lot of us think it should. I'm not a scientist, though. I'm just going by how people feel. Uh, you know, it's because if you follow the money far enough, you stop seeing separate companies. You start seeing a single structure, a financial superorganism quietly feeding on American illness. In the United States, there are 3 asset management giants that dominate the landscape of this country and, for the most part, around the world: Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. Together, they control more than $22 trillion. That's more than the GDPs of Japan, China, and Germany combined. And the deeper you look, the more you find the exact same 3 names sitting at the top of nearly every major food product company, pharmaceutical, insurance, hospital corporation, manufacturers. You know, this is not a market. This is consolidation. Think about media. And consolidation breeds control. Let's really begin with the food part of it. The 5 families of American food. The average grocery store contains more than 40,000 items, but more than 80% of it are brands that belong to just 5 corporations. All are controlled by the same financial owners. Well, per se, they're the primary stakeholders. Pepsi, Mountain Dew, Gatorade, Lay's, Doritos, Cheetos, Quaker, and Tropicana. Who owns them? almost 10% Vanguard, 8% BlackRock, 4% on State Street, total little right around 22%. Over one fifth of PepsiCo belongs to the same companies that own pharmaceutical companies that make diabetes medications. Pepsi soft drink portfolio alone contributes an estimated 25% of added sugars consumed by the American people. The system is not failing. It's working exactly how it ended up becoming designed. Let's talk about Coke, Sprite, Fanta, Powerade, Minute Maid, Dasani, and Smart Water, right? Ownerships. Like I said earlier, Buffett's company, 9.3%, Vanguard, 8.4, BlackRock, 5.6, State Street, 3.8. Oh, total of the big three is 17.8, and you add Buffett in, nearly 27% of Coke is controlled by four entities. Coca-Cola products contribute massively to our national sugar burden. And I really want to put out there that Coca-Cola is taking steps to try to, obviously you can't necessarily make that product healthy, but they're going to a more, they're going away from corn syrup and things of that nature and certain dyes. So, just kudos to them. I know it's still not good for you, but kudos to them for at least trying to make an effort. But who sells the insulin? It's the GLP-1 drugs. I think, yeah, GLP-1. The heart medications that result from like decades of consumption. The same shareholders. Let's talk about another company, General Mills, brands, Cheerios, Lucky Charms, Cocoa Puffs, Nature Valley, Old El Paso, Pillsbury, Betty Crocker, and I believe Yoplait as well. Who owns them? Vanguard 12.6, BlackRock 10.2, State Street 6.3. The total among the big three, 29.1%. Lucky Charms now is 38% sugar by weight. Trix, 46%. Cocoa Puffs, 44%. These cereals are massively marketed towards kids, despite the data showing that kids who consume high sugar breakfast are 80% more likely to develop obesity before the age of 18. Again, who profits later from the resulting disease? The same investors. Again, let's go to another company that we're all like really passionate about. Kraft Heinz, ketchup, Kraft cheese, Oscar Mayer, Velveeta, Capri Sun's Lunchables. Who owns it? Berkshire Hathaway owns 27%, 27.5% of Kraft Heinz. That's crazy. Vanguard 8.6, BlackRock 3.7, State Street 2.4. That's nearly half, I believe, right around there, of the company is owned by the same financial giants who also sit atop of drug makers, insurers, and again, more hospital chains. And Kraft Heinz products are filled with additives banned in Europe and most other countries, but perfectly legal here in the United States. Another company, Nestle, Gerber, DiGiorno, Hot Pockets, Coffee Mate, Purina, Nesquik, Kit Kat. Who owns them? Vanguard 4.5, BlackRock 4.4, UBS 5.6. Nestle is the biggest packaged food company on earth and the single largest distributor of sugar to children globally. When childhood obesity skyrockets, the healthcare system profits, and so do Nestle's top shareholders. Because they are the same shareholders profiting from the illness. Let's talk a little bit about that pharmaceutical part. We're going to flip this coin. Let's talk a little bit about Pfizer. Been a lot of controversy there, especially with with COVID and all that. And again, I want to throw out there that a lot of this started with investing, and a lot of that stuff starts with different kind of intentions. Things kind of snowball that way. That's how things like this seem to tend to happen. Well, let's talk about Pfizer and who owns it. Vanguard 8.1, BlackRock 7.3, State Street is 5.0. So 20% of Pfizer drug maker is owned by those same three companies. Pfizer sells medications for cholesterol, blood sugar, diabetes, nerve pain, all conditions linked to diet and processed foods. Johnson & Johnson, right? Baby powder, like some of our core products we all grew up with. Vanguard owns 8.8, BlackRock 7.3, State Street owns 5.4. Total 21.5%. Johnson & Johnson makes everything from blood thinners to surgical devices, baby powder, you name it. But more chronic disease means more procedures. More processed food can mean more disease. The system feeds itself. Eli Lilly, maker of the world's most powerful diabetes and weight loss drugs, Mounjaro, Zepbound. Again, you want to know who owns it? BlackRock, 7.9. BlackRock 6.8, Vanguard 7.9. They own about 15%. Their biggest revenue stream comes from conditions that directly match our diet. Now let's talk about that final loop a little bit. Insurance and hospitals, let's dig into that. United Health. Owners, Vanguard 8.3, BlackRock 7.3, State Street 4.7. United Health profits from chronic illness more than any insurer on the planet. 67% of their expenses and revenue come from people with chronic disease. The HCA Healthcare, one of the nation's largest hospital chains. Who owns them? Vanguard 6.6, BlackRock 5.3. Hospitals depend on surgeries, cardiac events, diabetes, complications, dialysis, emergency visits, nearly all of which are just downstream outcomes of because of how we're eating. The same three financial entities own the companies making the food that makes us sick, the company selling the drugs you'll need once you're sick, the insurance company that bills you for being sick, and the hospital chain that treats you for the sickness. These companies didn't start out just buying all this at one time. It's been allowed. I think that there needs to be some kind of limitations. If you own certain things, you can't own the opposite, right? Conflict of interest. Of course, you're going to do things that are going to favor certain aspects, which create these issues. Again, a lot of these problems go back to policymaking. That's where it goes back to. Your lawmakers, because your lawmakers allow these things. It's kind of sad. Food, illness, medication, and hospital profit. And the profit flows to the same places. This is not a conspiracy. This is all going to be in the facts. But this is corporate math. And the chemicals inside the food, that's where the story becomes even crazier. It's like this chemical web. What's really inside of our American food? This is the longest, most disturbing segment of this investigation. This episode's 4 parts, but there's a total of 8. Because once we examine what's actually inside of our food, the picture becomes undeniable. The U.S. food supply contains ingredients so dangerous that more than 40 advanced nations have banned them outright. Not restricted, not limited, not warning labels, banned. But here in the United States, in our country, these corporations don't even need to warn you. And they'll call you crazy if you mention it. Brominated vegetable oil, or BVO. It's used in Mountain Dew, Sundrop, Squirt, and many other store brand citrus sodas. It contains bromide, the same chemical used in flame retardants. It accumulates in your fat, your thyroid tissue, and the brain. Consequences that have been linked in some studies can say nerve damage, memory loss, tremors, and I believe issues with thyroids as well. Obviously you can see some behavioral changes. Across the world, it's banned in UK, EU, India, and Japan. The FDA allowed this for 50 years, despite knowing it wasn't safe. Only recently, after California banned it, did the FDA finally move. Why was this allowed to be used? Because it helps companies use cheaper oils and drinks, making it more readily available cheaper. Let's go to MSG. It's used in chips, soups, frozen meals, your fast foods, your seasoning, packets. It amplifies flavor, right? That's what it does by stimulating your receptors. But it also affects brain chemistry. Research has linked too much as MSG to appetite dysregulation, insulin spikes, increased fat storage, leptin disruption, headaches, and migraines. This neurotoxicity if you eat way too much. China, India, and Pakistan have now restricted MSG in certain food categories. We still allow it in virtually everything without even labeling transparency. Why so widespread, right? Because the MSG helps make things a little bit cheaper to taste rich, even if it doesn't got a great product. saving companies a lot of money. Potassium bromate. It's used in your bread, buns, pizza dough, rolls, pastries, tortillas. Potassium bromate makes dough rise higher, look whiter, stay softer. It's classified as a possible human carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. I'm not paranoid here. Kidney tumors, it's linked to thyroid tumors, gastrointestinal cancers, oxidative DNA damage they've seen before, though very rare. It's banned in the UK, the EU, Brazil, Canada, China, India, and Argentina. I want to forget about them. You got South Korea. Where is it still legal? Really? Here in our country. Why? Because it saves baking companies 2 to 10% per loaf. An ingredient banned by dozens of nations is still in American bread because it increases profit margins. It's not that some of these things are necessarily bad. They're bad in the amounts that we're getting them. When you really start to crack down and you look close, it's the amount and not everything. Some of these things are just bad in general, but in some of these cases, it's the amount that we're consuming, like, right? Too much sugar, right? Certain things. It's not just that it's bad. It's also the amount you consume of the ones that aren't terrible for you in small doses. I'm not endorsing eating them. I'm just trying to provide some fair context. Let's go on to the next one. RBGH, recombinant bovine growth hormone. It's like really, really crazy. It's a genetically engineered hormone designed to force dairy cows to produce more milk. It's banned again. EU, Canada, Japan, I believe Australia, and I think China. I'm not sure China, New Zealand, but guess what? It's allowed here in our country. Milk from these cows that are treated with this contains elevated level of IGF-1, a growth factor that is now linked to, in some cases, breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer. Accelerated tumor growth comes with cows treated with RBGH. They develop mastitis, painful underinfections requiring heavy antibiotic use. The antibiotic use gets absorbed into their muscles. That creates an antibiotic resistant bacteria that enters the food supply. Why is it still legal in the United States? Because Monsanto, and pay attention to this for later, lobbied for it. And because key FDA officials reviewing it previously worked for Monsanto. The revolving door made the decision before the science was even finished. Excuse me. Let's talk a little bit about the artificial dyes. Yellow 5, yellow 6, and of course, thank God, red 40. But all these things have been linked to hyperactivity, behavioral issues. Some people have allergic reactions. It's banned and heavily restricted, depending on the item in Europe. Mandatory warning labels are required over there. Here in the United States, one of them will have to warn you about it. Why? Because color sells. Think about casinos, right? People who walk through. Same arcades, artificial sweeteners, aspartame, a sulfame, potassium, whatever you want to call that. It's linked to studies that gut microbiome disruption, insulin dysregulation, possible carcinogens at high doses. But Europe is reviewing aspartame again. The US insists that it's perfectly safe, but the world keeps looking into it because something doesn't seem right. But there's a double standard here. Here's the comparison that should make every American look at these companies and go, do better, which, to be fair, like I've said, some of them are. The same companies that make this stuff here, they all sell chemical-free versions of these same products in Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada. They can make money over there. Obviously, maybe not as much, but they can make profits over there. Dew in the United States contains BVO. I mean, it's going away now, but Mountain Dew in Europe does not. Kellogg's cereals here in the United States contain a lot of dyes that are banned. And now they're going away here, but in the UK, you can only use natural food colorings. Some of our bread contains potassium bromate. In Canada, it's illegal. American consumers get the cheapest, most chemically enhanced versions of corporate products sometimes. Foreign consumers get the cleaner versions. What does that tell you? We're a test market sometimes. These chemicals aren't accidents. They aren't unknowns. They're choices. They're choices that have made because the U.S. regulatory system is weak, captured, and designed to protect corporate profits over human health when no one's looking sometimes. These choices made because sick populations are profitable populations. Choices made because illness drives revenue, not health. But why is the United States the only advanced country in the world that is allowing so many of these chemicals that are banned elsewhere? It makes no sense because of what we cover next. This part turns the frustration, if you want to call it, into fury. It's I call it the revolving door. It's how our regulators have become industry employees and become regulators again. If there's one segment that's going to tie this part and part two all into one, this is it. Because none of this could have happened for decades unless the very people appointed to protect the public were quietly working for the industry they were supposed to regulate. This is called a revolving door, and America has the fastest spinning one in the world. Michael Taylor, this is the order he went in. Monsanto, FDA, Monsanto, FDA. Nothing to see here. Nobody else embodies this problem more perfectly than he does. He was Monsanto's attorney, then became FDA deputy commissioner. He oversees approval of Monsanto's RBGH. He writes the policies making it harder for dairy farms to label milk as RBGH free. 1994, he returned to Monsanto as vice president. 2009, he's again at the FDA as the food safety czar. That's a conflict of interest. Gerberding worked at the CDC and then went to work for Merck. She was the head of the CDC for 7 years. Immediately after leaving, she became president of Merck Vaccines, earning millions in stock while overseeing a product line dependent on CDC recommendations. Your disease risk became her bonus structure. Scott Gottlieb, FDA, then Pfizer. Gottlieb was FDA commissioner until 2019. 3 months after he left this job, he joined Pfizer's board, one of the very companies whose products he helped accelerate through approvals. The referee became the MVP of the team he was regulating. Stephen Hahn, FDA, Moderna's investment firm. He oversaw the Vaccine Emergency Authorizations Act at the FDA. Later, he joined the flagship Pioneering, the venture firm behind Moderna. Regulatory, rewarded. Tom Vilsack, USDA, then went to work for the dairy lobby, and now he's back at the USDA. He ran the USDA for 8 years, then immediately became the CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, then returned to the USDA as secretary. The official responsible for regulating dairy became its top lobbyist, and then returned to regulate it again. Every decision bends toward these type of things, right? The result of the revolving door, these chemicals remain legal decades after other countries have banned them. These food corporations face almost no penalties for harmful formulations. Pharma companies raise prices with no fear. The insurance companies profit from chronic disease without pressure to lower the premiums. But the hospitals are growing revenue directly from preventable illnesses, and some of them aren't even making money. The regulators retire into 7-figure consulting jobs. Meanwhile, the American public, we get sicker sometimes while we're younger, and it's happening faster. Chronic disease is rising. Our healthcare becomes wildly expensive. If you want to know, and I don't want to hear this crap about socialized healthcare, this is just literally about the numbers, okay? Capitalism is supposed to produce better results than socialism. And it's supposed to make things more affordable, which it does in a lot of cases, but not in healthcare. Listen to this. The average family, when you combine contributions from employers and everything, $12,000 up to that a year in healthcare. In other advanced nations, does sickness benefit so many people in power? There's no other. The food makes you sick. It manages that. And I believe Germany is right around $7,000. That's the next most expensive nation for healthcare. But the hospitals are profiting, right? The regulators protect the system. They've worked for the very people that they're regulating. And the same financial giants all have ties into these. the American illness economy. If you feel your anger rising, good. The anger is the beginning of power with this, but don't do nothing crazy, nothing stupid. A lot of this was small things that built up into something big. And then the laws changed. But tonight you learned the architecture, the problem players, the chemicals, the corruption, the ownership, the incentives. If you're allowed to own food and then allowed to own the chemical companies and the insurance companies that all benefit from each other, there should be some kind of limits in there with certain things, But everything in this system, how it's set up now, is just inadvertently aligned to keep you consuming food that can make you sick. Paying for medical care that never truly heals you. Sometimes, don't get me wrong, doctors and nurses are great people. I've got a great family doctor. But, Europe takes more of a preventative standpoint. We treat illnesses, but to be fair, the system is trying to go towards more preventative medicine here. So we do got that going towards us. It's just our system's not designed that way, so it's not as easy as they want it to be. But part 2 is gonna really dig into some crazy things. We're gonna break the cycle in your home. We want to break it in your community. We want to break it in your politics and in your purchasing power. They want you to be quiet. They want you to be numb. They want you to be confused, but they want you to eat their products without hassle. But hopefully after watching this, you're a whole lot less confused. Because, a population that understands the system is a population that can reject the things that it should. This was part 1 of Big Food, Big Pharma, a sickening synergy that's happening in our country, and nobody's stopping it. Part 2 is going to drop soon. On Monday. Things are a couple days delayed. I apologize for that, everybody. Please don't forget, go to buymeacoffee.com. The link's in the description. Follow the channel on Rumble, follow us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, follow on Twitter. But, we love your support. Thank you again, and we're looking forward to getting a part 2 out to you. Have a good day.